Well, welcome to another edition of Cop Talk. I'm here with our producer, Mike Sherman, and the esteemed Bob Cohn, Editor-in-Chief Emeritus of The Light. Welcome.
Nice to be here, Larry.
Well, we wrote this week in our editorial about the interconnectedness of all things Middle East, and we must have been prescient because we're seeing that just this week. So let's start with Iran.
Yeah.
Iran's economy is falling apart, and there's massive internal unrest and dissension in the leadership ranks. So talk about that a little bit.
I think that there's clearly mass dissension in the leadership ranks, and they are obviously feeling the pinch of the more tougher sanctions that kicked in on July the 1st. Although I've heard some speculation that maybe Ahmadinejad's comments are a form of disinformation, that he wants to give the impression that the sanctions are hurting because he's afraid of the military alternative, something I hadn't thought of before. It actually came up this morning in a class that I was teaching. And I think it has an intriguing possibility.
I think it may, although the data on the street certainly confirms it. I mean, businesses are shutting down because the rial has dropped so precipitously. It's at its lowest value ever. There's talk about the potential for huge inflation as a result of the devaluation of their currency. So, I mean, we're seeing actual effects. We're seeing businesses and others protest on the streets.
The merchant class in particular has been quiescent during the whole, and they're really getting vocal now in their opposition.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think there's reality to the situation, no matter how they want to position it. And certainly one of the areas where there's a direct impact relates to Syria, because Syria has been one of Iran's longtime beneficiaries.
Right.
But now there's seems some support internally in Iran for cutting Syria off financially, given their own internal condition. What are the consequences for Syria should that happen?
They would be disastrous, along with the even more significant military encounter between Turkey and Syria. There was some shelling that went across the border into Turkey. Turkey responded militarily. Prime Minister Erdogan has been given authority to send troops into Syria, and they just may want to get this thing over with a surgical military strike.
Let's talk about that because Turkey is a NATO state, and once there's an attack on a NATO nation, it's considered an attack on NATO. So how will that play out? Will it escalate, and will it give U.S. kind of the ammo it maybe needs or perhaps was looking for to support a more forceful NATO effort against Syria?
And NATO actually officially did respond, saying you better not antagonize a NATO ally, and they invoked their own name in issuing a warning to Syria, and it could provide the same kind of basis for U.S. intervention, I would think, after the election, as France had provided by taking the lead on the Libyan thing with American support.
And how does this play out on the Palestinian front? Because, of course, both Iran and Syria have been supporters of some of the strongest Palestinian factions. And actually, we saw Syria label the Hamas leader as kind of a traitor to them this week. So the lack of money can really result in a lot of fragmentation.
I was stunned to see that Meshal, the spiritual leader of Hamas, who has been residing in Damascus for most of the past 15 years, was officially denounced, like you were saying. That's a pretty significant event. It actually could, ironically, free up Abbas from being under the thumb of Hamas as a vetoing power.
And that was my question to you.
It might provide an opening post-election for getting something done on the Palestinian front,
regardless of who's elected in the United States. Now, and also we now have Bibi Netanyahu appearing to take a much less strident line about timing for an attack. So my question is, there are a couple different reasons this could be. It could be truly because the sanctions are having some strong impact. It also could be because he's facing some strong internal political pressure, particularly now from his coalition partner, Ehud Barak. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think when he appeared before the United Nations and presented his famous or infamous cartoon of the bomb and drew the red line with a magic marker, that was his final bone or red meat to his right-wing flank, and now I think he is just facing the fact that no Israeli prime minister could afford to antagonize on a permanent basis. And, Obama was surging ahead in the polls up until last night's debate, so I think that he was just being the pragmatist and survivor politically that he always has been, and I think it's more of not wanting to drive a wedge between the United States and the State of Israel. We've been allies since 1948.
Do you think Barak has the potential, and there's talk that there might be elections early next year, do you think he has the potential to go toe-to-toe with Bibi in terms of building a coalition?
He does, but he's almost too smart for his own good. You know, he had actually been described by David Makovsky as having been more hardline than Bibi. So he's the ultimate pragmatist and survivor, but he tends to...
But on social issues, he's probably more liberal than
No,
Bibi.
no question about it. He was a former leader of the Labor Party.
Exactly, yeah. So anyway, let's talk about the elections, the presidential debate last night. Your thoughts?
Well, you know, I had a role in the debate club at U City High School, and we were never told which side we would argue until right before we came on. And it appeared that Romney, leaving politics to one side on points, clearly was the better prepared, more in command of facts and figures, whether they were fully accurate or not, and it appears that many of them were. And Obama seemed kind of caught off guard and almost not present, not there. I was struck by Jim Lehrer, of all people, being beaten up upon so severely. He's the dean of the moderating. He's moderated more debates than any other journalist in history. And I felt that he was being kind of unfairly scapegoated for, quote-unquote, losing control of the debate.
I think it was partly because of how the time limits were set up for the debate, you know, which wasn't entirely his doing. In fact, at all of his doing, the commission makes that choice. And I thought he used good judgment in letting them go on when necessary. And I thought the president, I think the president was either had a strategy to be very low-key, to contrast with Romney, very intellectual, or he could have been distracted. There may have been things happening in the presidency that day. It could be a number of reasons, but there's no question that Romney came on stronger than people thought he would, and will certainly serve him well in terms of the election. One other thing domestically, there's been a big to-do about ads in New York that are being challenged as Islamophobic, ads that are appearing on buses.
Right.
One of them reads, "In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat Jihad." And these have been propagated by a group that's headed by a woman named Pamela Geller, who's received much condemnation from interfaith groups and a variety of Jewish groups. What are your thoughts about those ads?
I'm familiar with her work, and I think it was a very unfortunate and inappropriate term, savage. It's just freighted with all kinds of 19th century condescending references and could be described accurately as an Islamophobic phrase. I also think lately that there could be something called Ameriphobic. I think there are people within the Middle East who have such a deep-seated visceral hatred for things Western, United States, Israel, the world Jewry, that they could accurately be called Ameriphobic. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency to give Muslim extremists sort of a free pass for fear of being branded Islamophobic.
Well, that's my question. How do we in public debate, discourse, rhetoric, how do we distinguish well between those that really deserve sharp, harsh condemnation, terrorists, radicals, folks who want to promulgate, a religious kind of state, versus those who are living their lives and trying to just get along like the rest of us, going to their jobs, raising their families, etc.
Well, Geller was appropriately condemned in the court of public opinion, and she had to walk back from it, even a hardliner though she might be. When Sinead O'Connor tore up a picture of the Pope, she was given worldwide condemnation, Pope John Paul II.
On Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Live, of all places. There was an artist named Serrano who had a crucifix immersed in his own urine, and that was called the Piss Christ, excuse the expression, and it was defended appropriately under the First Amendment, as are the obnoxious activities of Reverend Fred Phelps, who pickets military funerals. We have, and I think there needs to be a strong reassertion of our First Amendment precious rights of free expression in print and in speech, but it also needs to be exercised responsibly. And when it isn't, the best way to condemn it is with other free speech of condemnation, not by trying to suppress it.
I think so, and the more ideas and the less violence, the better. And in fact, we talked about the op-ed that was penned by the president of Tunisia, who basically said, what happened a couple of weeks ago in the conflagration relative to the Libyan embassy and what ensued, represents in his opinion, a relatively small swath, of the Muslim world. And that there are plenty of people, living their lives and desiring democracy and desiring a violence-free world in the Middle East and elsewhere.
As the 30,000 Libyans who marched on the streets of Benghazi to mourn Ambassador Stevens' murder and to reaffirm their commitment to those values.
Exactly. That's all we have time for today. Thanks again. Thanks to Bob. Thanks to Mike Sherwin. We'll see you next time on Cop Talk.